when I was around 12, I spent New Year's Eve at my friend's house whilst our parents went out to a restaurant in a nearby town. The house was old and pretty isolated, and to be honest, scared the crap out of me. You had to drive up a long, overgrown track to reach it. A lot of my other friends at school would say the house was haunted, and it was actually featured in a ghost book, if I remember rightly. So, anyways, we were sat downstairs in the lounge watching some TV and heard the loudest crashing sound. I still remember the look in my friend's eyes when we turned to each other in shock. It took us a while to get up and actually go and investigate what the sound was. We crept out of the lounge down the hallway to the rest of the house. The crashing sounded like it came from upstairs, so we headed up to check it out. When we got to the top of the stairs, there was a breeze coming from somewhere. It was cold, like ice cold. We moved down the hallway upstairs towards the wind and turned to go down another corridor. Bear in mind, this house was massive. Honestly, it was near enough a mansion from the early 1920s. At the end of the corridor was his mom and dad's bedroom. The door was moving back and forward slowly. We both stopped and just stood still, frozen, not saying a word to each other. After a moment, my friend walked towards the door. I was still frozen in fear and fell behind a little. As he pushed the door open and snuck into the room, the darkness consumed him. I could barely make out his silhouette. There was perfect silence for a couple of seconds before I heard him let out the most terrifying scream. My adrenaline kicked in and I ran towards the room to see what had happened. I searched for the light and turned it on. He was stood, frozen stiff and pale, just staring into an empty corner of the room. Just to the side of him was a massive antique mirror that was smashed into pieces and scattered all over the floor. I placed my arm on his shoulder and asked him if he was okay. She broke the mirror. I asked him who broke it. He said, "The woman in the corner, she told me." At that point, I was honestly like this, and told him we should leave. He turned to leave with me, just before we did. I wanted to check the mirror. Surely the wire had broken or something, I thought to myself. I bent down to the mirror and turned it over. The string that was holding it to the wall was intact. It hadn't snapped. I looked at the wall. The nail was still firmly fixed in the wall. At that point, I was so terrified, I told him to ring his parents and tell them to come home. We waited outside the front door until our parents arrived back from the restaurant. My dad and his went straight up to the bedroom to check it out. When they arrived and saw the broken mirror, they sort of pushed it off and said we were up to no good and playing a game that got out of hand. After that night, my friend never really spoke about it to me. The worst part, recently, I'm 24 now, I was having a general chat with my mom, and as New Year's coming up, that night came up. I told her about it, and she said, "I believe you. Your friend's mom told me a few days after that night that she had seen a woman in her room telling her to leave the house. It honestly sent my whole body tingling, and I had flashbacks to that night, although it's coming up to almost 12 years ago now." Three of my friends and I were spending the night together on New Year's Eve about a year ago, and we decided we wanted to spend the night in a tent outside, really close to the woods. We were laughing and around. You know, normal teenage things. Then we heard this rustling outside in the leaves. Figuring it was just an animal or something, we shrugged it off. At this point, it was nearing midnight and we had a flashlight on in the tent, and we were blasting music. That's when all hell broke loose. We heard this chirping noise outside. When I say chirping, I don't mean it was like a bird or a raccoon, but this unearthly chirping that didn't sound like any animal at all. In fear we were about to be ambushed, I demanded my friends temporarily turn off the lights and the music. At first they looked at me like I was crazy, but I strengthened my tone. "Turn it all off. Now!" At this point, they knew I was serious, so they turned it all off and listened. There it was again. This unearthly chirping that didn't sound like anything. My friends and I were shitting bricks, but I was a little bit braver than the rest of them. I had been taking karate for about 4 years, and I'm a very tall female capable of taking down a grown man, so I figured I could take whatever was out there, or at least I could carry one of my friends if we had to run away. They all tried to play it cool and said it must have been one of those screamer firework things, but I could tell they were all shitting themselves. We carried on screwing around for a few more minutes, desperately trying to forget about the screech chirping thing outside. Then we heard it again, this time much closer to our tent. This was the first time I could properly hear it. When it made a clearer sound, reality drop-kicked me in the stomach. It was big, and it was almost right outside our tent. My friends and I were about to shit ourselves, so they start asking me questions as to what I thought it was. I was the friend who was into all things paranormal, and I still am, but I've never been a paranoid person, so they asked me. I told them just as a suggestion that it could be a skinwalker or a flesh gate, because I read somewhere that they mock the voices of your friends of emit noises that they think will lure out their victims. I only said this because I thought that could explain the scream chirp, but I think they were really scared. We heard it again. At this point, everyone was shitting bricks, and one of them eventually called her older brother to come and hang out with us for a while. While he was there, just our luck, we couldn't hear the chirp screech anymore. Damn. We hung out with him for a while, until we all decided to go on a walk with. The walk was fun, and my friends were terrified because we were walking around in the dark, but I've always liked the dark, as it was so vast and mysterious. I was also hoping we would find the flesh gate so my friends would stop acting like stuck-up little shits that weren't scared because I could see they were shitting themselves. Part of me was also terrified to see what would happen if we stumbled across a flesh gate, but her older brother had a knife with him and I was prepared to stab it if he wasn't. Fast forward later into the night. We were blasting music again and playing with a multicolored strobe light. Probably not the best way to avoid being jumped in the night now that I think about it. My friend's brother had left us his knife in case we heard anything else that night. My friends all decided that I was the only one who would be brave enough to actually stab someone or something, if it came to it, so I was in charge of holding the 6-inch knife all night. Thankfully, it was in a sheath, because despite my training, I'm quite clumsy, especially this late into the night. I couldn't help myself taking the knife out of the sheath because it was so interesting and beautiful looking. There it was again. The same chirp screech. I unzipped the tent to look, knife drawn, and heard something scurry away quickly into the woods. Since my friends didn't hear it, I left it alone. Everything was fine for the rest of the night. That is, until I was the only one awake. I heard this horrible scream howl, much more blood-curdling than the chirps. It kept getting closer to the tent and then backing away, like it somehow knew I was the only one awake. It circled us, made itself sound distant, then come back with another howl. One of my friends briefly awoke and told me it was probably someone having a party, but I could tell she was just saying that so she could get the sleep she desperately needed. Me, however, I could go for 3 days straight without having to sleep once. I was perfectly fine without sleep unless I had a long day of school the next day or something. Believe me when I say, I didn't let my guard down once. I listened to this thing in the location the cries took place. I wasn't about to let some flesh gate or some shit come and kill my friends, and I on a night that was supposed to be fun. I drew the knife a few times and practiced slashing the air in case it attacked, but it never did. The just spent hours taunting me, trying to draw me out. I was incredibly tempted to run out there, just to get a look at it, but I knew that was exactly what it wanted, waiting for me not to be in a group so it could pick the threat off, then my friends. There was no way in hell I would let it anywhere near my friends. The older brother had left to go to a friend's house later that night as well, and the friend we were all staying with lived with her grandma, no strong men. I lived around the neighborhood, and both my mom and my dad were home. My dad is a big guy, standing at 6'2" and strong as hell, but it would be too far to run. I couldn't go out there to see what it was even if I wanted to. Even though I'm pretty damn fast, I was weak considering how late it was and I would become this thing's prey. Knowing this, I just laid back, knife at the ready, listening in absolute horror. You don't know what true vulnerability is until you're on the outskirts of the woods in a tent with 3 lives in your hands, while some paranormal creature is hunting you, teasing you, and you only have a close combat weapon that you're not even certain would put a scratch on it. I sat there in silence until around 6 in the morning when I was certain it had stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. The damn thing had driven me insane. My work there was done, as I was certain it was gone. I left the knife on my pillow and a note that said I went home, and I wasn't dead so I could reassure my friends when they woke up later on. I began to walk home to my house with the streets poorly illuminated by street lamps. There weren't that many, leaving a of dark spaces that I couldn't see even if I tried. To make matters 10 times worse, My glasses were smudged, and I could barely see a thing out of them. I knew it was better to my advantage if I kept them on, though, because I'm blind as a bat. I scanned my surrounding my whole way there, keeping my eyes on every direction this thing could attack me from. It was probably just waiting to get me alone, but I wasn't going to let it do anything to me. When I finally got to my house, the door was unlocked to my relief, so I could get in without my parents hearing me. Unfortunately, this was 5 in the morning, and as I mentioned before, clumsy as ever, so I bumped into everything as I tried to navigate myself to my room, where I forced myself to go to sleep. After that, when asked, my friends would say it was a screamer firework or some animal, but I can tell they were scared and just trying to make sense of it all. I tried to make sense of it too, but I just couldn't. I knew what I heard, and it was much worse than they could have imagined. They probably thought I mentioned fleshgates and skinwalkers just to scare them, but I truly believe it was one of the two. Nothing like this has ever happened again, but there's a reason we haven't been sleeping outside in a while. This happened on New Year's Eve of 2021 when I was 17 on a now-deleted app called It's Me. It was an app where you could talk to people all around the world without the fear of showing your face as you created your own animated avatar. Looking back, the app was a really enjoyable experience as I met people I'm still friends with today, but most people who used It's Me could agree that it could get toxic. Many users, including myself, trolled parties, which were basically live streams where a host could allow 3 other people to be talking with them, and the party's guests could comment in the chat. One time I was trolling a party when I was new to the app, and the host was, unbeknownst to me, quite notorious on the app and already had a large following. Before this, I'd never heard of the host, although I knew a couple of her friends. Her name was Kaylani, and mine was Seleni's. Not my real name. Usually, the people I trolled didn't have the reaction I wanted, like arguing back. But this one host started arguing back, and we went back and forth for a while, with the party getting many guests and the comments were going wild. After the party, I texted her on the app going back and forth with her again, until we were full on beefing and I asked her to pull up. Really, I didn't want to fight this girl, because I was only arguing with her in the first place for shits and giggles, but she was taking me serious. She told me she lives in Chicago and I live in Milwaukee, so I thought there's no point in driving 1.5 hours just to fight a girl that I've never even met. At the time, I was stupid and still had the mindset of a hood rat, so me pulling up to this girl wasn't far-fetched. It got to the point where this bee wouldn't shut up, so I did something I still regret to this day. I told her I'd meet her at her place if she was with it, and she accepted. I hopped in my car and put her address in the GPS. Not gonna lie, the apartment building she lived in looked sketchy and ghetto, but I didn't really care because I also was from the hood. I brought my twin sister with me, just in case Kaylani had people with her to jump me. As we pulled up, I saw a girl who looked to be Hispanic and had sneakers and a hoodie on, so I presumed it was her because of her accent and her clothes. I told my sister to wait in the car because she looked to be alone. I ran up to her and we started fighting. Not to brag or anything, but I've been in many fights growing up in the hood, so I do know how to defend myself properly. To be honest, I was getting the best of her when, out of nowhere, some guy proceeds to pick me up and try and separate us. At first, I thought it was some kind of security of the apartment building, but he wasn't wearing any kind of uniform or anything. Actually, he looked quite a mess looking back, and he reeked of alcohol too. He managed to somehow separate us, even though at this point I was going batshit, and Kaylani was still trying to get little hits in. By this time, my sister came out of the car when she saw the guy getting involved and presumably Kaylani's friends who came from inside the building trying to hold her back. After we were separated, the guy literally starts dragging me to a rusty, beat-up black Honda that was parked nearby. I started fearing for my life and screamed my sister's name. She came sprinting, but the guy had already opened the trunk and threw me in, trying to shut the trunk. I was kicking and screaming, but he was really strong and managed to shut the trunk. My heart practically stopped when I felt the car speed off. I can still remember my sister's screams for help. We drove for 5 minutes and I'm claustrophobic, so I was frantically trying to get out the tiny trunk. I was texting my sis, and luckily she informed me. She had called the police already and she was following the car. After a few minutes, the car stopped and he lifted the trunk and dragged me by my hair into some house that looked run down and dirty from the outside. He practically threw me into the house, and I saw my sister running after the guy with a baseball bat we brought just in case anything bad was to happen. She managed to get one good hit on the man with the bat, but he kicked her off and locked the door. Even though I heard sirens nearby, I was still terrified of what he was going to do to me. He dragged me into some room in the back of the house, and the whole time I was fighting him off as best I could. The police burst in a couple seconds later, however, and tackled the man. Surprisingly, he didn't resist and was quite calm, letting them handcuff him. I was reunited with my sister, and in that moment, I realized how precious life can truly be. Ever since that day, I changed for the better. Me and my sister no longer beef with anyone, and we've definitely grew up in the past year. After the incident, Kaylani left the app. I decided to call it Quits Me soon after as well, because many people I was cool with starting moving on, and I wanted to leave the memory of that day behind. I never told anyone on It's Me what happened, not even my friends, as I was afraid no one would believe me.